it was a lot of effort to create the renewal playbooks or try to mitigate this risk. And all of that time could have been spent doing one-to-many motions earlier in that customer's journey, or keep them engaged from the start when they're coming out of a already highly engaged onboarding, so that by the time you get to the renewal, they're already engaged. Or if they're not, you've already flagged that risk way before and you had a longer roadmap to mitigate, and then pull in some human touch points if need be, before it's like, I only have 2 months to try to renew this customer.
Welcome to Customer Unsuccess, the podcast where we cut out the noise and talk with real leaders about their hardest lessons in customer success and other go-to-market motions. I'm your host, Joe DeGrande, and in each episode, we're going to unpack real challenges from real leaders, failed tech implementations, a strategy that didn't yield results, or difficult customers. But more importantly, we're going to take those lessons learned and share them with you, so that way you can avoid those same mistakes with your team. So if you're in customer success, sales, or other go-to-market motions, stick around to hear from the best. Now let's dig into it. On this week's episode of Customer Unsuccess, we're joined by Marie Lunney. She's the founder of the DCS Connect community and the director of Scaled CX at Binder. She talks about a time where she dove straight into automating renewals and ended up falling flat and resulting in some angry customers. She also talks about why starting with your automations and internal workflows might save you from embarrassing misfires. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you do too. Now let's dive in. Well, good stuff. Let's kick this off.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So, Marie, thank you so much for coming on the Customer Unsuccess podcast. So I have obviously Marie Lunney. She is the founder of the DCS Connect community, where it's pretty much the go-to community for digital CX and digital CS, everything, knowledge on tech and strategies. So definitely check it out there. She's also the director of Scaled CX at Binder, and I'm excited for our chat today, Marie.
Yeah, definitely excited for this. I love the concept of unsuccess.
I love it because one, it's always, we can always have a good laugh, maybe not in the moment at the at that time, but it's always fun to look back.
No, you think the world is ending when you can I curse on this?
Oh yeah, you can say whatever you want.
The world feels like it's ending when you fuck up.
Yeah.
And then I think a lot of professionals, depending on what your tech company does, but generally tech is not saving lives. So you come down from the adrenaline rush and realize you're like, okay,
yep,
I can learn from that, and hopefully I can teach some other people today to avoid my mistakes.
No, 100%. Yeah. And I think also too, this is something that people forget. You have to try. You're inevitably going to make mistakes, but that's how you learn, right? I think you brought the key up. Totally. The key thing is learning lessons, what to avoid in the future. And obviously that's the goal of what we're trying to help the audience to making sure that they could avoid those landmines or mistakes, errors, whatever it is that we want to call it. But yes, we are not saving lives, unfortunately. But so it's always
our own lives would have more meaning if we were.
Yes. But when we spoke, I believe you mentioned your third time kind of building digital CX and digital CS programs. And early in your career, you were talking about when doing digital, there was a specific story of just like when you were in there, you kind of leaned more into the renewals aspect. I guess tell me more about that story, because I think it's CS, especially now, right? There's the talks of it being really shifting to a more revenue-based function, or as it should have been, or whatever that debate is. But I know it's a hot topic, so I'm curious to hear that story and your perspective during your career.
Yeah, so a little bit of background: when I first started building out scaled or digital customer success, it wasn't under that umbrella. It was actually in the umbrella or guise of product marketing and post-sale product marketing. So the task or my role was, how do you drive onboarding, adoption, retention, and expansion through scalable or marketing channels? And I would say in that role, I transitioned into that role having been at that company as a previous CSM. So we knew the product really well. I knew the customer journey really well. And I had a little bit more playground room. And I tackled more about adoption and driving value realization in that role. It wasn't until I had an official digital customer success title at my next company, where the focus was much more, okay, we need to drive more revenue. And the mandate definitely was on, especially in scale and with one-to-one CS, driving renewals. So I think it's common when you are a CSM or a CS leader that you're so focused on your quarterly reports are who's up for renewal, how are we going to renew them? And when you then say, okay, we need a scalable way to do this for our long tail of customers, your focus is still on that kind of short term, how do you renew the customers up for the renewal? So that's where I was being asked to focus, and that's where I did focus. And I think I quickly learned, generally the channels that I have available to me are email. And later, I got other channels like in-app, but generally it's just email. And you're automating some of these first touch points. And especially in this lower scale, you're probably not meeting with the customer that often, if at all, depending on your model. So if you start to send emails out of nowhere when like a few months before they're renewing, you're going to get crickets.
Sure.
And you're either going to get crickets and be like, oh no, they're not responding. And we need to like pull in the ghosting playbook and start to try to branch multi-thread and go on LinkedIn and use all these human resources to try to get this customer to renew, which is kind of the antithesis of what you're trying to achieve. Or they email back and say, oh, thanks for reminding me, I don't want to renew. And then again, you go into like risk mitigation scariness. And of course, you get the ones that are like, cool, yeah, let's send me my renewal paperwork. But it was a lot of effort to create these kind of renewal playbooks or focus, and then how do you try to mitigate this risk, at least initially. And all of that time could have been mitigated and spent doing one-to-many motions earlier in that customer's journey to engage them earlier or keep them engaged from the start when they're coming out of a already highly engaged onboarding, and mitigate that risk earlier in their customer journey so that by the time you get to the renewal, they're already engaged, or if they're not, you've already flagged that risk way before and you had a longer roadmap to deal with, to take some digital-led touch points to mitigate and then pull in some human touch points if need be, before it's like, I only have 2 months to try to renew this customer. So that was like a huge, huge lesson learned. And now at Binder, and whenever I talk to other folks who are starting to build this digital motion out, it does always start with mapping your customer journey, and it starts with then building that customer journey for the beginning of the customer journey. Like how do you facilitate that happy path that will mitigate risk down the road?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think a lot of people could kind of forget about focusing on the overall life cycle, the customer journey, and miss those key points. And kind of tell them, hey, regardless if it's one-to-many, enterprise, one-to-one, however we define it, how do you treat your customers? How are your customers that are doing well and they're consistently renew? What was their journey like, right? And then you kind of take it back, focusing on, all right, well, there's a lot of hand holding. You're probably nurturing throughout the life cycle. you still have to figure out how to scale that. Maybe not to the same
Mm-hmm.
level, but it's still important. And you brought up some good points, right? If you're just going in there asking for money, yeah, it's going to be pretty jarring, especially if they're just not, if there's obviously a disconnect, right? If they're not going to renew, like, hey, well, you never spoke to us however many months before. Now you're asking
Mm.
for money. Comes
Yep.
off in a weird light. Yeah.
Yep. I think it's also there's so much overlap with marketing when it comes to kind of the forms and functions of digital customer success. And my customer success background informed that customer journey and kind of like what does it take to get a quality renewal. But it was my marketing background that also taught me the 7 ways concept. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not. I guess like tell me more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's called rule of 7 is the proper terminology, but essentially it's a marketing concept. You might hear like 7 times 7 ways. So
Hmm.
on average, it takes messaging or connecting with a potential buyer or a user or whoever it might be, your audience, 7 times before they actually take action.
Hmm.
So it's typically used in the concept of like your messaging, like you have an ad and then you're sending a prospecting email and they're clicking on a white paper and all the different things in pre-sale marketing, but
Sure.
all of that applies to the post sale and how do you get your engaged digital customers to take the actions that you want to. So keeping that in mind, if a customer is already like checked out, sending 3 emails is not gonna make them engage. And sending 7 emails, that's also not the message. It's like don't send 7 emails to an unengaged customer, but you have to send 7 emails to already engaged customer, or and flag that risk if they're not engaging and get them re-engaged much earlier on, because it does take that much like effort and messaging and repeated engagement to have them take the actions you're hoping them to take.
100%. No, I'm curious. Like, let's dig into that a little bit more, right?
Mm.
And that's really cool on the Rule 7 because I'm actually thinking about it too, from like even the new business perspective or just sales in general. Usually, we've always given the recommendation of like, hey, it's 7 to 8 touch points to at least get a response or for them to take action. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of rings true for a lot of different functions. But
Yeah.
when we're talking about engagement, right? So what are some of the things that you would like to see? Maybe it's in that particular role, right? Because I think engagement could be a lot of different things. It could be just the way they
Mm.
respond to an actual touch point, communication, engagement with the product itself. Like, I'm curious
Mm.
more about what that means to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to start somewhere. So, I think usually when you're starting and building up this motion, you might not have the type of customer programs. Like, you only have their software that they're using that they purchase from you and the communication that you're sending to them.
Sure.
So that's generally where you would start. But I also have learned, again, probably influenced by my CS experience, that just because someone's using your product doesn't mean that they're happy with it.
Yeah.
So I will say that you have to combine those touch points or engagement, where maybe you also then focus on using NPS or some kind of CSAT score to inform more of the sentiment experience, or even just looking at the number or quality or sentiment of their support tickets. So you're not just blindly saying, okay, their app usage is high, they're happy, they're engaged, where we can set it and forget it. So of course, start with what you have, then build on. I would say sentiment would be the next piece. And then the third piece is starting to build out those customer programs. So this is also an area that I currently own at Binder and have owned at previous companies, of what are the different ways that customers can engage with your company, whether through like self support or through more like education. So this could be your knowledge base, articles and guides. It could be educational webinars or video. Could be your university or LMS courses, could be your community. So ideally, you're building these out so that there's multiple places for them to engage. And I apply the same methodology of like the 7 times 7 ways is the more resources you have available, the more likely a customer is to engage with one of those resources. And you just have to make it really easy for them to engage with those resources is the hard part. So they don't have to go down these 7 different pathways and get stuck in a rabbit hole. But that's the ideal. It's like, okay, now you have all of these different places that they can engage with you as a brand, and you can also get that feedback loop of, are they engaging? And if yes, are they engaging in a way that is valuable to them?
Makes total sense. And going back to like the initial story at that company, right, when they were focused heavily on revenue, right? And there's obviously a lot of parts of the life cycle, right? Obviously, it's more, sounds like it was more direct renewal, expansion, pretty much it, as opposed to just also focusing on onboarding / implementation or adoption and engagement throughout, the journey. I guess in that particular scenario, because they were so renewal and just revenue focused, what was like the first step, if you can remember, that you implemented like a change? Was it like, hey, was it onboarding? Was it adoption? Like, I guess, like, what was like your first, I guess, plan of attack?
I remember there, one of the earlier things was definitely like an escalation framework, an escalation pathway. So like, how do we identify risk through these? At the time, it was mainly product usage, but I think we also had some support or bug like data in there as well. And then how do we take some digital-led outreach to mitigate that risk, try to get them on the happier path. And then if we see that they've then engaged with those touch points in a negative way, whether they email back and say like, yeah, I'm pissed, or they don't engage at all, and that's also a risk, or they don't engage at all, and we see that, more importantly, they don't engage and we don't see that risk go away. We still see that in the data. Then what is that kind of manual intervention and escalation and visibility to the executives? And at that company, I will say that something that was really valuable was executives of different departments were all bought into working together to mitigate customer risk. So I think if you can do that, especially if you're at a smaller company, it's really valuable because it creates that ownership of like, we all are swimming in the same direction and want the same things, which is like to have a prosperous company. Sure. And having that executive alignment was really helpful to mitigate risk. You mentioned something though of like onboarding. I also remember that being, and also have seen, if people don't start with renewal, then typically they're starting with onboarding. And I do in some ways think that onboarding is a great place to start. It's oftentimes, it's your first impression with your customers. There's the tale as old of time of like handover from sales to CS is always a mess and can be improved.
Sure.
And it's when the customer is the most engaged. They're like, typically they just made this investment. They're like ready to go. They're excited. So there's a lot of things working for you in focusing on onboarding to find efficiencies and also get your customer's time to value reduced. What then again I see as a kind of a misstep is people are like, okay, we did the onboarding, we improved it. And then they forget about like, there's then, especially in scale, like tends to be a huge drop off of, we have this curated, facilitated customer experience, and then we just like don't talk to them. Like we don't touch them, we'll email them, give them any guidance until maybe renewal. And depending on how long your contracts are and how short your onboarding is, like that can be a big gap. So again, I mentioned this earlier, like if you're just starting out, number one is map your customer journey, and then definitely choose a place to start. Earlier in the customer journey is better, but try to figure out like what are those maybe like quick wins or like quick touch points that you could maybe build like one into each phase, so that as you kind of expand and build onto the customer journey, there's not like this really great customer journey experience in this one phase and then a drop off, or like nothing and then everything, or
Sure.
depending on where you start.
It makes total sense. And yeah, it is a shame when, organizations, they just focus on the implement and it's almost like they're just forgotten about. And it could have a negative connotation when it comes to the customer experience, and then obviously their satisfaction long-term. I'm actually curious at even digging in a little further on the executive buy-in piece, because I've seen that in a number of organizations. Some I've worked at, implemented, some strategies there. But I think it's important. I think there's a lot of impact by getting them all bought in and potentially contributing to, whether that's retention or expansion, depending on how their organization's structured. But I guess like, can you tell me more about that as far as like what that meant, for that particular scenario, that organization?
Sure. So, I mean, I can't take credit for the way that was set up.
Sure.
I think that was really driven by the founders. And yeah, I think mainly driven by the founders, but also speaking to each of the executives in a way that was like, well, what do you care about? And at the end of the day, okay, product, you care about building products that brings more revenue and keeps our customers. So if you care about that, then an escalation about your product, you must then care about, right? So I think just, the classic what's in it for me messaging was probably discussed, or I know was discussed amongst them. The framework that we had was essentially, especially in the scale segment, but this applied to all tiers of customers, where the first layer was digital-led touch points. So triggers or manual to identify, hey, there's risk happening.
Sure.
Our risk categories mapped to our churn categories. So one, it just created consistency from like a automation perspective, from a reporting perspective, but we could also track, okay, how many risks did we mitigate, or how many of these risks were flagged and then still resulted in that same churn. Sure. So it was helpful to be able to tweak our responses and how we mitigated these risks. So first started with digital led, and then if those weren't fruitful for the reasons that I mentioned before, it would then get escalated to, if it was not an owned account, it would get escalated to a pooled CSM. If it was an owned account, it was already with the CSM, so they would escalate to their manager. At the manager level, the manager would mitigate, but there would be a once a week manager meeting. So the managers were CS, sales, product, support. Trying to remember if there was more. I don't think marketing was involved. I think those are the folks involved.
Gotcha.
And they would review the escalated, the escalated escalations. And each of them owned a specific one of those categories or a few. And then they would take some risk mitigation steps with the CSM. And then if it reached kind of an SLA, or depending on kind of certain factors, whether it was like a really big account or they were up for renewal within the quarter, that would then get escalated to the executives. And similarly, they would have a once a week meeting to review the current open escalations and take mitigation. And then at that company, I was owning CS Ops. So this whole process was something that I built out, and then had dashboards that they could report on to see the ARR that's at risk, the ARR that we mitigated that was formerly at risk, the churn or the risk reasons, the like average days that they've been open for as well. Trying to remember what else was on there, but yeah, it was really effective. And I think it was just very clear of like everyone in the whole process knew what they owned and how and what to do.
Yeah, I love it. It's a lot of times I talk to companies and different stakeholders. There's always that challenge of they always have competing KPIs and metrics, but the fact that you've been in some organizations where it just all ties in together. And then also they have essentially a venue to kind of speak that out, and seeing how they can contribute directly is so powerful, because it's just a collaborative initiative. And I know it sounds so cliche, but it's sometimes some companies still run into that issue.
It's like, I feel like it's so much easier to implement at that level of a startup. Yes and no. I'm going to like play devil's advocate for myself,
Sure.
but it is because it's smaller, and because the executives in theory are like more connected and talking maybe a bit more often. It isn't because classic startup is like you're running a mile a minute and like, it's very easy to just be like, yeah, you go over there and do your stuff and whatnot.
Sure.
But also then once you get to a company size of like 500, it's also, in some ways, I think it becomes harder then, because you really do need to kind of silo to be able to like be in your specialty and really focus on what you guys need to do. So I think at that point, it really is up to probably the CEO to make that decision and say, this is how we get there, and let me align everyone's KPIs. I'm a big believer of like, people do what they're incentivized to do. Yeah.
No, you're 100% on the ball. And yeah, it does start from the top, right? Those KPIs have to be set. How do they impact other KPIs and other teams? And then, it's pretty much goes from there. But I'm curious and obviously I'm always interested on the automation piece. We're very similar on that fact, and we run like these digital CS, tech touch programs, however we want to define them. But talk to me about some quick wins in general. I'm always curious to hear other people's like quick wins of what they should be like automating, right? Like we're talking about different parts of the life cycle, sure, but I'm curious from your perspective what you've seen be quick wins. Not to put you on the spot.
I actually don't think there are quick wins with automation. And the reason is because it all starts with the data. Like you can't automate things unless there's a trigger, and the trigger is some kind of data source. And data typically either doesn't exist or is a mess. So that's also a lesson learned, is I think I did try to, in my first role, like automate some emails, and then you get like a shit ton of bounced emails back, or like angry emails being like, why are you emailing me? I don't even like do that thing. And you're like, oh, our source for this contact is not correct. Like it was a marketing contact and not actually a customer contact. Or like these people don't exist, and now we risk our domain being flagged for being spam. I think there's not too many quick wins you can do when it comes to automation, but it is well worth really focusing on your contact hygiene, I would say, to begin with. If I had to do it over again at that first company, I would have started much earlier with that.
Yeah, data is key before starting any automation. Yeah, I've had my own failure stories on that front too, and I mentioned it too many times on this podcast, but you could definitely piss off a couple more than just a couple of customers if you just don't understand how your data, just how it exists too. Like sometimes it is clean, you just don't have a familiarity of what, right? Like you mentioned a great example. Who's a marketing contact versus maybe who's an end user, or a particular contact role could have a pretty significant impact. Actually, it's a good segue into another question I'm curious about, because we're talking about different points of automation, right? And how you could, again, make the team more efficient. But what's your take on between internal automation, right? Like something that's being served up internally to reps, leadership. I think you mentioned those few examples, and then actual outbound, like external automation that impacts the direct customer.
Can you clarify the question? Like, what's my opinion on where to
Like,
start, or what's more beneficial? Or
so I guess it's more so on, like, I guess maybe if you're just starting out, or what you've seen be the most beneficial, or maybe you have some pretty good examples of where it's like, hey, this was a home run, where it was internal or external, or maybe you started internally versus externally. It's kind of open ended, but I'm curious.
Yeah. I'm sure you get this all the time on your podcast, because I know I get it all the time in the community, but it's like such a it depends answer, it depends on what tools you have available. It depends on what's already built. Like, I think amazing quick wins, not from an automation perspective, but typically within like this customer experience or scaled customer experience, are more content based. It's like, how do you create a self-service guide to like a quick start guide? Or I had created essentially like this is your customer journey deck that was like, okay, I'm in my onboarding phase. Like, here's my resources, and this is what I have to do, and these are the baselines I have to set if I want to measure value down the road. And that was a really helpful guide for all segments. So I would say a lot of the quick wins I've had have been more content based, of like, what are the questions that are being asked, and the content that I can create to fulfill that need. Whether that's customer questions, or like CSMs are like constantly looking for it or asking for it. Because similarly, I think I've been at companies where the internal knowledge maybe is lacking, and it's like, oh, they just need process documentation, and we could save them a bunch of time.
No, true.
So that's one that comes to mind. I do think it's typically less risky to create internal automations versus customer facing automations. And depending on your background or where you're coming into the company, you might also have more visibility into where those pain points are and where you can make some quick wins. And I think that's also, you're going to get the feedback loop is quicker and more confined. So if you do fuck up, you're going to like learn in an isolated incident versus if it's customer facing. But if you're also successful, you're going to get a whole lot of praise because it's more felt and closer versus the customer. You rarely hear like, oh my God, I loved this thing that you built. And like, they should actually not know that it's automation, right?
True.
So
right.
you're probably not going to get that feedback loop, but the feedback loop is like, are they taking the action that you're hoping them to take from that automation or that program? So that's another one that comes to mind. It's just it depends answer.
But I love the example on the self-serve of like the customer journey, because it helps both the team. Like, if you have a new person at the organization coming on onboarding, they understand like what are the key things that should be happening in an account lifecycle. And it goes back to the customer too. And you can kind of keep both accountable. And it's something that's so small but standardized, still counts as a scalable way of managing your customers. So that's great.
And customers constantly are asking like, well, where am I at compared to other customers? So if you give them a guide of like where they should be at, and of course you don't have to provide the data in the beginning if you don't have that data. But as you optimize that guide, you can say like, hey, from a data perspective, like, here's your usage, and typically we see people are at this point,
Right.
Another one that I wouldn't say is like a quick win, but I think you can easily get like a V1 out there and optimize again off of that, is value realization. So even if like the guide that I just mentioned, like you could put that in that guide, or you could send this via email. Ideally, this is embedded in like your sales process. And so it's like constantly with them throughout their customer journey. But coming up with, and especially work with your CSMs, if you've been a CSM, even better at the company because you have that knowledge. But if you are new coming into a company, work with the CSMs of why are customers purchasing us from like a business perspective? What are they trying to achieve?
Sure.
And how do we lay that out in a framework of value drivers? What are the KPIs to be able to track that? And ideally, you can map that back to any kind of analytics that you have in your product and translate that. But that might be a later kind of progression. But at least you have a framework of like, okay, this is my business objective of purchasing your software. This is my baseline. This is the KPI that I'm going to be tracking. And this is the target milestone that I'd like to see these results. And establishing that in the sales cycle, one is a great way to consultatively sell and actually get the deal. But then handing that over into the CS team, and that can be done through internal automation or efficiencies. And then reintroducing that with the customer through an automated email and kind of facilitating that. You can get automated value realization where at a certain point in their customer journey, you send that email and say, hey, this is what you told us. This is what you care about. This is kind of where you're tracking, or even you don't have to add the tracking from in the net, like first version. You can just say, are you achieving this? Yes or no? And that can be collected through like a form, like type form,
Sure.
and routed back to your CRM. And then you can, put them onto different customer journey, automated journeys based off of their response. If it's yes, great, they're on the happy path and we have value realization that should inform a healthy renewal. Or if it's no, then what is that escalation pathway, and how do we then send some resources to mitigate that, or then escalate that to a CSM or a pooled CSM to take action.
100%. No, I love it. I love it too, because I know we bounce around in a couple of different areas too, but when we talk about data, I think it's a very intimidating topic. And the fact that you bring up like type form, simple form survey, and just yes or no, those two very direct responses could lead to two different journeys. And something as simple as that, again, could still be automated to a certain degree, at least just starting out. And I think it's potentially lower-ish lift than some of the more complex, automations that people come up with. So that's awesome.
But again, like the lowest lift of that is like maybe you don't have that whole automation or collection feedback, but you can give them the framework.
Exactly.
And you can continue to facilitate that and remind them of the framework. And again, the seven times, 7 ways, hopefully by the time they should have seen value and like have a positive ROI or positive outcome, they've had that socialized so much that they have been thinking about it or working on it.
100%. No, that's great. And I know I'm just, I think we're coming up on time here, and I kind of want to, like, we went into a bunch of different ways, which is great. I love this. But when we talked about it, I guess like some of the key takeaways here, and correct me if I'm wrong, add your spin to it, but a lot of it has to do just understanding the overall account lifecycle, right? It's not just always about renewal, right? And it could have also, if you're just essentially just asking for money, you could have some pretty unhappy campers, but and then the other piece too is, I think, at least I caught it, is internal automation less risky, can have a bigger impact on your internal stakeholders too. But I'm curious to hear some other key takeaways to kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, I would say key takeaways, learn from my lessons. If you're doing scaled customer success, don't immediately focus on renewal. Focus earlier in the customer journey. When it comes to automation and dipping your toe in that, you can get, it's definitely less risky to do internal automation, and it can get you some quick visibility and kind of kudo points. If you're going to start to dip your toe into external, make sure your data is clean or understand your data. And then some of your quickest wins might not be that sophisticated. They might be more about, content or internal documentation. It just really depends on where that gap is and what resources you have. I think the last one would be, as you do build out these touch points to maybe replace or replicate one-to-one touch points, even if you choose to focus earlier in, like, let's say the onboarding or earlier adoption phases, try to think about what's one or two touch points that you can add in to the other stages so that there's not large gaps in a customer experience.
Awesome. No, I love it. I guess we're talking about so many different things that, at least back when I was in school, weren't around. There's no course, from what I've seen, digital CX, or even now, go-to-market engineers is like a newly coined term of understanding how to use all these different technologies to scale go-to-market motions. But I'm curious, where did you go to learn? Like, I was always a reader, and that's kind of self-taught there, as well as videos online. I'm curious, where do you go to, just learn about what you're doing?
Yeah. So when I was first starting, I would say, and I'm still kind of like this, is I'm a very hands-on learner. I love to get my hands into technology and I taught myself how to HTML code. Look at that. So I'm a little bit of a cop out of just get your hands dirty and tinker and play around. But as I progressed and wanted to find other like-minded folks, I did create DCS Connect, the Slack group for other skilled CS professionals. And that's been such an amazing source. I did it not fully for the good of other humans, but also selfishly for myself, so that I could have connections to other people that are building out different programs. And I've learned really awesome ways to approach things that sometimes I've taken to my own company. I was talking to a guy who had built out digital QBRs through connecting Zapier and Google Forms with their data source. And I was like, I didn't even know you could embed tokens into Google Slides. And you can. So I wouldn't have known that if I wasn't connected there. So that is my main source of learning of what is possible in this realm where we all are, I think, tinkering.
No, it's awesome. I love it. It's definitely, yeah, I've been in the community myself. I've learned quite a bit of different ways in which people have been leveraging different tools for different use cases. But yeah, I think being just kind of engrossed in it, it's a good way to learn. And then also tinkering too. You can find out new things and different use cases, and then it could be fun.
Yeah.
For sure.
Nice.
So where can everybody find you, Marie?
I'm sometimes on LinkedIn. I feel like I go in waves of checking my LinkedIn and not, but I exist on there. You can find me and accept or send a request. And on my profile, there's a link for the membership request for DCS Connect if you'd like to join. Otherwise I'm in Amsterdam. So if you're ever in Amsterdam, you can reach out to me in LinkedIn and we can grab a coffee. Not at a coffee shop though. That has a different meaning here.
No, for sure. That's awesome. And we'll put those links in the show notes too, so that way everyone can find them easily. But
Perfect.
This is great. Well, thanks so much, Marie, for making the time. Love the conversation. This is great.
Likewise.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
That's a wrap for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening. If you got some value from this conversation, hit subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who's also out there trying to build a better customer success or go-to-market strategy, even if it's messy along the way. And if you want more frameworks, tools, automated playbooks, check out jodastechtouch.com and subscribe to our newsletter. That link is in the description. Thanks so much for being here. Keep building, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one. Quick note before we wrap. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. The ideas and opinions shared here are of my own or those of my guests. and don't reflect the views of any current or former employers, clients, or partners. We might reference tools, platforms, or companies, but nothing shared here should be taken as fact, endorsement, or criticism. Do your own research and always consult your team or legal counsel when making any business decisions. This content is not legal, financial, or business advice. It's just us sharing what's worked, what hasn't, and how we've learned from both. So thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.